By late 1915, the Western Front had ceased to be a war of movement and had settled into a brutal, pathological stasis. The conflict had become a monstrous engineering problem. The ground between the opposing trenches, no man's land, was a desolate, shell-pocked scar of mud, water-filled craters, and triple aprons of dense, razor-sharp barbed wire. Artillery reigned supreme above ground, ensuring that any massed infantry attack resulted in slaughter. The problem facing both the Allied High Command and the German General Staff was simple yet insurmountable. How do you force a decisive breach in a defensive line that was continuously reinforced with concrete, steel, and machine guns? The engineers, the silent strategists of the war, provided a terrifying solution. The only way to bypass the lethality above was to fight a secret war beneath. This was the birth of the tunnelers. Specialized companies were formed, drawing their ranks almost exclusively from men with deep pre-war experience in subterranean excavation. For the British Expeditionary Force, the BEF, this meant recruiting thousands of coal miners from Wales, the Midlands, and Scotland, as well as hard rock miners from Canada, Australia, and New Zealand. These were men who possessed an intimate, almost primal understanding of how the earth moved, breathed, and held its weight. The objective was straightforward, but required staggering effort and courage. Dig tunnels known as saps or galleries, sometimes descending 60 to 80 feet to escape the threat of countermining, and push them beneath the enemy's main line. At the terminus of the sap, a huge chamber or mine chamber would be excavated and packed with tons of high explosives, often a volatile mixture of ammonal or gunpowder. The subsequent detonation would create a massive, instantaneous crater, obliterating the enemy position, killing every man within the immediate radius, and providing a momentary smoke-filled breach for the infantry to exploit. But the work was not merely engineering, it was a psychological duel. The tunnels were typically narrow, less than 4 feet high, and just wide enough for one man to work in cramped, agonizing positions for hours on end. They were perpetually hot, reeking of sweat, damp earth, lamp oil, and the faint, coppery smell of decaying life carried by the groundwater. The atmosphere was thick with the dust of digging and the constant crushing knowledge that at any second the timber supports could fail, or worse, the German tunnelers digging just a few yards away could set off a charge that would collapse the sap and seal their tomb. Our protagonist is Sapper Edward, Teddy Davies, a man whose life had been shaped by the darkness of the earth long before the war. A coal miner from the tough valleys of the Rhondda in South Wales, Teddy was a member of a community where going underground was a way of life. He was used to the creak and groan of the pit, the constant presence of explosive gases, fire dam, and the brutal physical labor. Yet the German tunnels, he quickly learned, were far more unpredictable and deadly than any natural fault line. The German enemy was listening, calculating, and actively seeking to bury him. The trenches themselves were a surface wound, but 50 feet beneath, a clandestine, silent life-and-death struggle for geological supremacy was being fought, where victory was measured in a catastrophic explosion and defeat was eternal darkness and silence. The true front line was now beneath the mud, and Teddy Davies was one of its most essential, silent soldiers. Sapper Teddy Davies' immense value to the 251st Tunneling Company, Royal Engineers, transcended his physical strength. It was his acute, almost preternatural sense of hearing that made him indispensable. In the suffocating blackness of the sap, where eyesight was useless beyond the immediate glow of a carbide lamp, the ability to listen, to distinguish the subtle sounds traveling through the earth, was the difference between a successful mine placement and mass entombment. Teddy's primary role was often that of the clay kicker, or more critically, the listening post operator. The listening post was a position demanding the highest degree of nerve and patience. It was always situated at the absolute terminus of the sap, the point closest to the enemy line, often separated from the German miners by just 3 or 4 feet of damp, vibrating clay. The main tool was the geophone. Imagine the geophone, a heavy brass or wood stethoscope-like device mounted on a tripod or simple stand. The operator would press the instrument against a wooden stake driven firmly into the tunnel face. The geophone acted as a highly sensitive seismograph, amplifying the faint vibrations of sound traveling through the Earth's mantle. For Teddy, the post became a self-imposed psychological and sensory gauntlet. He had to lie perfectly still for hours, his ear pressed against the diaphragm, controlling his breath and heart rate. His existence narrowed down to a single critical focus, filtering out the relentless background noise of his own body and the massive war above. He had to discern the subtle, crucial acoustic signatures of the enemy. The taps. The sound of a dull, wet thud was the enemy digging in soft clay using specialized, non-metallic tools, a technique mirroring the British clay kicking. A sharp tink or clink was metal striking rock, timber supports, or, perhaps most terrifyingly, the thin, metallic casing of an already placed British explosive charge. The saps. The low, rhythmic sloshing of water could mean a natural spring, or it could mean the Germans were deliberately flooding the British sap with pumped water, a common, non-explosive method of attack designed to force the tunnel's abandonment. The final warning, the sound that froze the blood, was a constant, repetitive, rhythmic thump, 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 which indicated the Germans had stopped digging and were now tamping, packing the loose earth tightly around their high explosive charges in preparation for detonation. This sound meant the time for action was measured in minutes. The physical constraints added to the psychological strain. Digging was often done by the clay kicking method to maintain absolute silence. The miner lay on his back, supported by a wooden cradle, pushing the clay from the face into the sap with a wooden board strapped to his feet. The excavated spoil, or the muck, had to be carefully bagged and hauled out. This agonizingly slow process was crucial because a noisy shovel scraping clay would instantly betray the sap's direction. The environment itself was torturous. The air was stifling, often rising to 100 degrees Fahrenheit with 100% humidity. The constant fear of tunnel sickness, a severe form of psychological shell shock caused by the claustrophobia and the constant expectation of being buried alive, plagued the men. Teddy knew that his entire company's life depended on his ability to remain perfectly still, perfectly calm, and perfectly accurate in that tiny, suffocating space. He was the unsung, silent sentry of the underworld. So the mounting tension beneath the earth finally escalated to a crisis point in the Messines sector, a part of the Flanders front notorious for its treacherous geology. The area was characterized by deep, wet, unstable clay, perfect for digging, but highly prone to sudden, catastrophic cave-ins. The strategic point in question was a slight but critical rise, known to the British simply as Point 44. From this rise, the German artillery observers enjoyed an unassailable view across the British rear lines, making any troop movement or supply run a deadly risk. The British 251st Company, under Captain Blake, had spent months digging a crucial deep sap network beneath Point 44, intending to place a massive defensive mine there. However, Teddy Davies, meticulously monitoring the listening posts, reported alarming changes in the subsurface acoustics. The enemy was not just digging, they were aggressively countermining, pushing a heavy timbered gallery parallel to the main British sap, and it was getting closer by the day. "Captain," Teddy reported, his voice low and strained in the dim light of the command sap, "they are on a dead run. I can hear the timbering work clearly now. They are no more than 3 feet of clay away. We are parallel." The German objective was clear: detonate a large camouflet, a defensive charge designed to collapse tunnels rather than surface earth, directly beneath the main British gallery. This would destroy the tunnel, bury the miners, and collapse the ground above, making it structurally impossible for the British to use Point 44 for observation for weeks, a severe tactical victory for the Germans. Captain Blake faced an impossible choice: evacuate, pull the miners out, losing thousands of man-hours of work and surrendering the strategic high ground indefinitely. Detonate prematurely, set off their own massive mine before the Germans got too close, risking a catastrophic misfire or the inevitable flooding of the newly formed crater, but at least destroying the hill. Fight. Engage in a direct, deadly duel of acoustics and explosives. Teddy, relying on his deep experience in avoiding flooded sections of Welsh colliers, argued for the direct engagement. He recognized that the German digging pattern was predictable in its intensity. He proposed using a series of psychological deceptions, short, irregular bursts of tapping on the clay face, to convince the Germans they were digging in a different, irrelevant direction, while simultaneously starting a highly silent drilling operation. The goal was to drill a narrow, water-filled borehole away from the main British sap, toward a safer position where they could eventually set a camouflet. The danger of this plan was almost unbelievable. The high-pitched whine of the manual drill, however faint, was a sound the Germans would immediately recognize as a clear threat. If the enemy heard it, they would assume the British were about to place a massive charge and would detonate their own mine, instantly, without warning, killing everyone in the sap. It was a terrifying, all-or-nothing bluff designed to buy hours of precious time, relying entirely on the German miners' caution and Teddy's ability to interpret their reaction through the geophone. The fate of Point 44 rested on Teddy's nerve. He led a small team of 3. Captain Blake insisted on being present, into the listening post, equipped with a hand-cranked earth drill, a small quantity of ready-to-use explosive gun cotton, and the ever-present geophone. The air in the sap was already hot and heavy, the humidity condensing into a relentless dripping sound that made listening almost impossible. "Right, lads, no sound but breathing," Captain Blake whispered, his voice barely audible. Teddy resumed his position, pressing the geophone against the clay face. He immediately confirmed the German progress. They had reached the end of their sap and were in the packing phase. The soft, rhythmic thudding of soil being tamped down around the explosive charges was clear and unnervingly close. The German detonation was a matter of an hour, perhaps less. Teddy initiated his gambit. Using a short, dense length of timber, he began to tap against the separating wall, creating short, irregular bursts of sound, not the steady rhythm of excavation, but the confusing sound of a worker scrambling or shifting equipment. He was acting as a noisy decoy, a final psychological distraction to draw the German focus away from the silent drilling operation. Suddenly, the packing sound stopped. The complete silence was more terrifying than the noise. Then Teddy heard it, a sharp, distinct, high-pitched whine. The Germans hadn't been fooled. They had pinpointed Teddy's noisy tapping, assumed the British were panicking and setting a charge, and were now drilling a small camouflage charge directly toward his position to collapse his sap. They were aiming for a quick, localized cave-in that would bury the British team instantly. Teddy ripped the geophone from the wall, shouting, "Camouflage! They're drilling! Get back!" There was no time to escape through the narrow, twisting sap. The German charge could blow in seconds. Captain Blake, acting on raw instinct, ordered the pre-prepared emergency charge, a bag of gun cotton hastily packed into a side alcove, to be armed. This charge was small, designed not for the surface, but to blow a localized hole in the clay wall and disrupt the incoming German blast. The fuse was cut to a near impossible 2-second delay. The 4 men pressed themselves against the furthest timber supports they could reach, huddled together, waiting for the hiss of the fuse. They had consciously placed themselves in the crosshairs of 2 simultaneous explosions. The weight of the earth, the crushing silence, and the knowledge of the impending blast compressed time into a single, agonizing moment of expectation. They felt the cold, hard reality of their situation, a duel fought not with rifles, but with the raw, terrifying power of compressed earth. The moment of detonation arrived with a violent, sickening finality. Captain Blake later described the ensuing shock in his official report as the most terrifying event of his war. It was not noise, it was a physical blow, a simultaneous hammer from the earth itself. The British emergency charge detonated first, a sharp, contained crunch that shook the sap violently, ripping out the nearest timber supports and throwing fine clay dust and fragments down the shaft. Immediately following, the German camouflet exploded. The two concussion waves collided in the narrow space between the two tunnels. The crucial design of the underground duel played out. The two explosions created a localized pressure point that was vented through the path of least resistance, the clay itself. The result was a massive, though contained, collapse. The earth separating the tunnels fractured, twisted, and fell into a chaotic, muddy void. The competing blasts had essentially collapsed into each other, and the sheer weight of the falling earth sealed off the German sap entirely. The explosion had created a successful tactical entrapment. Teddy and his team were battered, deafened, and thrown against the tunnel roof and supports, but they were alive. They were immediately plunged into absolute darkness, the lamps extinguished by the blast wave, and the air was thick with the acrid, burnt smell of explosives and the sickly sweet odor of methane gas released from the shattered clay. The end of the British sap was completely choked off with tons of loose, wet, unstable clay. The four men were forced to rely on their miners' instincts, crawling backward through the dark, fighting against the suffocating mud and water that began to seep rapidly into the gallery. They had to constantly check the remaining timber supports for signs of imminent secondary collapse, working by the faint, flickering light of a single salvaged carbide lamp. The victory was immediate and absolute. The Germans, losing all contact with their buried miners and finding their sap sealed by an impenetrable barrier of mud and twisted timber, were forced to assume their enemy had detonated a massive charge and destroyed the tunnel network. They temporarily abandoned the sector beneath Point 44, conceding control of the strategic high ground. Teddy Davies, the quiet Welsh miner, had not just survived a duel explosion, he had won the most dangerous type of duel in the entire war, relying on courage, quick thinking, and an intimate understanding of geological stress. The crucial observation post was saved, and the silent victory was secured. The immense tactical success at Point 44, achieved at such close quarters, was immediately cloaked in the deepest secrecy imaginable. Within the closed world of the tunneling companies, Teddy Davies was a silent hero. But outside that world, his actions simply vanished. The nature of the tunnelers' war demanded complete and total anonymity. Captain Blake ensured Teddy received recognition not through formal military channels, which would have necessitated extensive paperwork and public knowledge, but through the miner's own code, a formal recorded commendation in the company's private war diary, which would only be read decades later, a much-needed 3-day rest leave, and a permanent supply of the best rum available. Teddy, a simple man, valued the practical recognition far more than any medal. The extreme secrecy was a necessity for both tactical and psychological reasons. Tactical superiority. The Germans had to remain ignorant of the depth, location, and true extent of the Allied mining networks, revealing that a single listening post operator could accurately pinpoint the enemy's sap and successfully neutralize a charge at such close range would have allowed the Germans to adjust their tactics and destroy the entire network. Silence was the most effective countermine. Psychological warfare. The threat of the mine war was most potent when it was invisible and unpredictable. The sudden, violent rupture of the earth was a constant source of terror for the German infantry. Knowing that at any moment the ground beneath their feet could erupt, regardless of their trench depth, was a debilitating fear. By keeping the specific details of the countermining silent, the Allies maximized this fear. The toll on the miners continued to mount. The sustained, silent tension often caused a unique and crippling form of post-traumatic stress known as tunnel sickness or tunnelitis. This wasn't the visible shaking or stuttering of the men in the trenches. It was a deeper psychological trauma characterized by debilitating headaches, profound spatial disorientation, overwhelming panic attacks triggered by enclosed spaces, and the constant, irrational fear of being buried alive. Teddy, despite his success, was not immune. The near-simultaneous blast at point 44 left him with chronic headaches and a hyperacute sensitivity to sound, a cruel affliction for a listener. Yet, he continued his work. He saw his duty as absolute. He had a unique, essential skill, mining, that no one else in the infantry possessed, and he had to use it to save the men above. The men in the trenches who relied on the tunnelers' silent protection knew the truth. The sudden, violent rupture of the earth was the terrifying yet welcome proof that the mole men had just done their silent, deadly work. The hidden war fought by Teddy Davies and the tunneling companies was the long, arduous prologue to one of the most stunning and visibly effective offensives of the Great War. For 2 years, beginning as early as 1915, the British engineers had conceived and executed a masterpiece of subterranean military engineering beneath the strategically vital Messines Ridge. The plan was audacious: dig 21 deep saps beneath the entire German defensive line along the ridge, some running over 2,000 feet long and placed as deep as 100 feet. The excavation was a staggering feat of labor, carried out in conditions of suffocating heat and perpetual danger from German countermining and geological collapse. The total network contained approximately 1 million pounds, or 450 tons, of high explosive, a mix of ammonal and gun cotton, all packed into vast cathedral-like mine chambers at the very base of the enemy's forward defenses. Teddy Davies' early work helping secure the crucial listening posts that allowed the main deep galleries to be dug safely was essential to the success of the overall project. The plan culminated on June 7, 1917, a day that forever changed the face of the Flanders landscape. At precisely 3:10 a.m., after 2 years of silent, continuous digging, the 19 viable charges were detonated simultaneously along a 10-mile front. The resulting chain of massive, earth-shattering explosions was so colossal that it registered on seismographs across Europe and was widely reported to have been clearly heard in London. The physical effect was devastating. The explosions instantly vaporized German trenches, bunkers, and command posts, creating 19 massive craters that remain visible today. The blast instantly killed an estimated 10,000 German soldiers. The psychological impact was equally profound. The surviving German soldiers were left in a state of shock and terror, their entire defensive line simply dissolving beneath their feet. The infantry attack that followed, led by the Australian and New Zealand forces, was one of the most successful opening maneuvers of the war, capturing the entire ridge and pushing the German lines back miles. The victory belonged unequivocally to the silent men who had spent 3 years living, listening, and working in absolute darkness beneath the mud. Despite the resounding success, the danger never truly left Teddy. He was pulled out of the active saps in late 1918, suffering severely from chronic tunnel sickness, severe headaches, and lung issues caused by the constant exposure to explosive fumes and dust. He was deemed unfit for frontline duty and sent home to Wales. The War of the Tunnelers was officially over. The saps were flooded or blown shut, closing the book on the subterranean conflict and ensuring that the tunnels and the terrible battles fought within them became a literal, buried secret. Sapper Edward Teddy Davies returned to the Rhondda Valley, not as a celebrated hero, but as a quiet, ordinary man attempting to reintegrate into the harsh reality of civilian coal mining. The war had left him with an invisible wound, a profound sensitivity to sound, a crippling claustrophobia that made working in the deep pits agonizing, and a pervasive, quiet guilt shared by many survivors. He never spoke of the war. Above ground, he was just another miner who had survived the conflict. He died in 1952, an unassuming figure, largely forgotten by the public history of the Great War. Yet his actions and the actions of the tunneling companies had a massive, defining, yet anonymous impact on WW1. They forced the Germans to divert significant engineering and military resources into the costly and terrifying game of countermining, tying up hundreds of thousands of specialized manpower. Crucially, they broke the trench deadlock, culminating in the magnificent, earth-shattering victory at Messines Ridge, proving that the silent, deep war could directly influence the surface campaign. The legacy of the clay kickers is not easily measured by medals, which they rarely received. It is measured by the vast hidden infrastructure they left behind. The war's end did not stop their work from influencing the landscape. Even today, the vast Messines craters are visible, deep scars on the landscape, and every year, unexploded WW1 ordnance, UXO, including unexploded deep mines, are still discovered by farmers and construction crews, a constant reminder of the war fought deep below the surface. The heroism of men like Teddy Davies was unique in its quietness and its reliance on industrial skill. They fought a terrifying war where fear was based not on a bullet, but on the silent geological certainty of entombment. They relied on their industrial skills, their courage, and the absolute, perfect science of listening. They were the unsung, essential heroes who literally carved out the opportunity for victory from beneath the feet of the enemy. The tunnelers were the embodiment of the quiet professional, a specialist unit whose existence and success were classified out of necessity. They proved that courage wears many uniforms, and sometimes the most decisive front line in a war is the one measured by the thud of a pickaxe 50 feet down in the dark. Their silent war remains the deepest, most terrifying secret of the Great War.